All right, well, welcome to everybody. Thank you for joining us virtual this evening. I'm going to get things started. My name is Kate Walker, and I am the Marketing and Operations Manager for the Shaker Historical Society, but I am also a Shaker Heights resident. And one of the many reasons that my husband and I decided to raise our family in Shaker was because of its legacy of being one of the most progressive communities in Northeast Ohio, and also because of its commitment to diversity and tolerance. However, I do think it's extremely important to acknowledge Shaker's history with race is much more complicated than its current reputation. Through my work at the Shaker Historical Society, I've learned so much more about the unfortunate beginnings and ups and downs of Shaker's relationship with race and integration, including how far that we've come since our founding. For example, in the early 1900s, the planned utopia of Shaker Heights that was envisioned by our founders, the Van Swearingen brothers, they actually used deed restrictions to make the community exclusive and to actively prevent a diverse community. Then in the 1950s, many white residents fled when Black families began moving into Shaker Heights. It wasn't until a bomb was planted in the garage of John G. Pegg, an African-American lawyer in the Ludlow neighborhood, that the community came together to form the Ludlow Community Association. And the LCA worked to create an integrated neighborhood and sparked progress around the issues of race, equity, and inclusion in Shaker Heights, and that continues to today. But we all know that the work never ends, and that leads us to our conversation tonight. As DEI is a commitment that every member of our community needs to make every day, we wanted to talk with our panelists here about their roles, their goals, and their visions for Shaker Heights today and in the years to come. So without further ado, I would like to thank Councilwoman Carmella Williams for moderating this conversation, and to Dr. Larry Burnley, the Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer for Shaker Schools, Colleen Jackson, the Chief Diversity and Equity Inclusion Officer with the City of Shaker Heights, and to Shaker Heights Mayor David Weiss for joining us tonight. I'd also like to remind everyone watching this recording that it will also be available on YouTube after the talk, and to please put any questions that you may have into the chat that you would like us to address. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Carmella.
Okay, thank you, Kate. Good evening, everyone. Thank you to the Historical Society for creating this space for this conversation. We only have a limited time tonight, so I'm sure we all would like to just dig into the conversation. So my first question is to, we'll target what we're here to talk about tonight. We're talking about shaping Shaker's future and what diversity, equity, and inclusion means to you. Now, of course, our panelists are going to answer this question, but for everyone at home, I put that in quotes, for everyone at home, I think that's a question we should all sit with and think about. And as we go through this discussion, see if your answer is the same at the start as in the beginning or at the end. Okay, so Colleen, we'll all be on first name basis because this is all about connecting and being inclusive. So we'll leave our titles at the door. Colleen, please, what does diversity, equity, and inclusion mean to you?
Oh, such a loaded question. And I knew I was going to go first. I knew it was going to happen. It means a lot to me. You know, I won't quote any of the definitions that I usually use if I'm doing a presentation. I'll just talk more informally. You know, when I try to help people understand what it is I'm here to do, I usually say diversity is just all the ways in which we differ, all the ways in which, all the different identities that we can have. It's everything that is unique and special about you or that you share with someone else. It's just the ways we identify. And diversity in itself means just having a good representation of those differences in a space. Equity is really making sure people have access to things in the same way, taking into consideration their situation, their circumstances, and anything that might be a barrier to them having equitable access or the same access as someone else. And so that means, for me, equity means trying to ensure that those barriers are eliminated. I often say, I think my job is to identify and eliminate barriers, and it's to equity. And then inclusion is everybody that's at the table having some space at the table to say what they need to say, considering the different or the diversity of perspectives of the people who identify there based on their circumstances. So, I think that diversity is a good place to start, and I don't think you can get to inclusion without equity, which is why I'm okay with the letters in the order that they are in my particular title, because that's kind of diversity is something we're all familiar with. Equity is the vehicle we use to get to a place of inclusion. So that's what I feel about it.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Burnley, Larry.
I was gonna say, I thought we were getting rid of the titles.
I know, I defaulted. Larry.
Well, I really appreciate Colleen's, how she frames the terms. I think for me, when I think of diversity, the first word that comes to mind is gift. It's, we all are, we bring various identities, and we bring many, and they intersect in a variety of ways. So diversity is really a gift. I think the identities that we bring, the histories and cultures and experiences that shape are how we see ourselves, how we identify, the ways in which we think, celebrate, mourn, are gifts shaped by the many identities that we are. And so it's a gift that I think, as a society, we fail often to leverage and embrace the gifts that our identities are. Sadly, I think our identities present themselves or perceived by others as something to fear, and they're threatened by, which create the kind of barriers that Colleen spoke of. So diversity is a gift. I think it's one in which I think we need to learn how to embrace and leverage, quite frankly, to the benefit of the human family and of the planet in general. Equity, when I think of equity, I think of outcomes, quite frankly. I think of the kinds of, it's how do we as a society or any community, any social group, create the kinds of circumstances that allows those who are occupied in a particular space to be positioned to have the opportunity to have equitable outcomes. So that suggests then, when there are these persistent inequitable outcomes, I think we have to then understand the why, and to be able to identify barriers, policies, and practices that inform the kinds of inequitable and persistent outcomes that we have, in the ways in which they disproportionately impact persons and communities with specific identities. So I think of outcomes when I think of equity. How do we position ourselves to achieve equitable outcomes across multiple different identities? And then finally, inclusion. Inclusion means everybody. I think inclusion really does have to do with practices and policies that demonstrates valuing everyone in terms of their voice, their presence, and that all the gifts that they bring in terms of their diversity and identities. Inclusion means we're setting up spaces, policies, and practices that values everyone, and that inclusion then requires us to pay attention to whose voices we're not hearing, who's not in the room, and to understand why. And so inclusion is an ongoing process. It's complex, it's dynamic, and it's unending.
Okay, thank you. And last but not least, David, what does diversity, equity, and inclusion mean to you?
It's interesting when you get asked this question. I don't know about others, but it's interesting the number and the perspective, but the number of ways that we can describe these. And each one I hear, I think, oh yeah, I like that one. And then someone else will speak and I'll say, oh yeah, I like that one too. It's kind of like, what's your favorite, favorite dessert? And it's hard to choose. So, I've heard and read lots of different definitions, and I certainly will to defer to the experts of Colleen and Larry. But I think what they've said is accurate. The one thing that I guess maybe I agree with. The one thing I guess I would maybe say that I sometimes think of these three concepts as almost like one of those Venn diagrams where there's overlap. Sometimes you're talking about diversity and focusing on the diversity of experiences and thoughts and et cetera, and the value that brings to a community. In other cases, as Larry was saying, it's talking about how do you make sure for inclusion, how do you make sure everyone's at the table, or in equity. So to me, it seems like it depends on the topic and depends on the context of the conversation, but sometimes it's a focus on one or the other. But I also find it interesting to see sort of where the three intersect and where we as a community want to be. And to me, you want to be where that intersection is, where no matter how what the issue is and no matter how you're addressing them, you bring all three concepts to what you're doing and view it through, so to speak, that lens of all three. And you may focus on one or the other, but to me, that's the way I'd like to frame it in my own mind, I guess.
Okay, great answers. I would say if you ask me that, and I'll just share this, diversity, equity, and inclusion to me means that we have different people with different needs, and we want to make sure that we acknowledge all of their needs and wants and that they feel included. Colleen, you talked about something, you used this phrase that I would like to make into a bumper sticker, that people are sometimes feel like guests when they're stakeholders. And so on that diversity, equity, and inclusion spectrum, everyone should always feel like a stakeholder, regardless of what it is that makes them different. So great answers. So let me ask you then the next thing then. The next question would be, or ask, would be that you share some things that your organization is doing on the diversity, equity, and inclusion front. What are you working on now? What have you done? And what do you have on the horizon for the future? And this time, let's start with Larry.
Okay, you're gonna start with the newest guy. Well, so the district was launched about a year and a half ago, a comprehensive strategy to really advance diversity, equity, and inclusion, as well as other goals and objectives associated with important elements of what it means to be a school district. With regard to diversity, equity, and inclusion, there is a very intentional attention being given to identifying persistent gaps in terms of student achievement and understanding causes that are resulted in really significant disparities in terms of student achievement in ways, disparities that are disproportionately impacting Black students in terms of their achievement. And students that are also from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, but even those who are not. And so we are in the process of developing a comprehensive and really implementing a comprehensive strategy to change that. But let me say this, because I am new to the district. I arrived in January 3rd, and I am in the process of really trying to understand not only this moment that we're in at Shaker and the work that's being done that's attempting to move us forward and to effectively address these gaps in achievement that we see. I'm really wanting to have a better understanding of what has occurred here in Shaker in and beyond the district that has informed how we understand diversity, equity, and inclusion, and the investment that we're making to understand, again, policy practices over time that are impacting or informing these disparities that we see. These disparities are outcomes of practices, again, practices and policy over time. And my concern is that oftentimes in institutions and efforts to impact or respond to a contemporary challenge, we don't take the time to look back. Even as we speak right now, there's a program going over at the high school called Sankofa. Sankofa, as you know, or maybe not know, is an Ndinkra, a West African concept that really, it takes the form of a symbol of a bird looking backwards. And what Sankofa suggests or calls us to do is, it says that in order for us to understand this current moment and to set a positive course forward, we must first look back and understand what has happened over time that informs this moment, that got us to this point. So as I come into the district and contribute to the advancement of this plan, I'm concerned with how we develop the capacity as a district and by extension as a city to look back and to really understand. And my concern is that we don't do this very well, quite frankly. We don't look back in terms of how policies and practices over time has disproportionately advantaged some and disadvantaged others. And if we don't do that, quite frankly, I think it becomes very difficult, if not impossible, to develop the kinds of remedies and set policies and practices moving forward that allows us then to really dismantle and disrupt the realities of systemic racism and other forms of oppression that are causing the kinds of disparities that we see. So Carmella, I've gone on really beyond your question. So I'm learning a lot. I'm really trying to learn a lot about where we are and how Shaker got to this point, and then how we build the capacity as leaders and as educators to have the kinds of very difficult conversations, very complex conversations that really disrupts a lot of what we're doing and allows us to set a very different course moving forward.
Okay, thank you. Please, that was all good information. And one of the things I don't know if the district has gotten away from this because of the place that we're in within the pandemic, but the district had some classes called Leading for Equity, where residents volunteered. It would usually be a class of 20 or so people that would come in and have these, they would become comfortable with being uncomfortable, those types of conversations with a facilitator. And it helped to create some equity warriors out in the community. And they're everywhere. So I'm sure some will stop by and visit both of you. Mayor or David.
Thanks, Carmella. Yeah, maybe the short answer is we're doing a lot, I think, but maybe the way to frame it, and then I'll actually hand off the baton to Colleen, but I guess it starts most recently by our adoption. I'm trying to remember, Carmella, when we officially adopted our new mission statement for the city in the area of DEI. But I'll just read it because it's very short. It says our mission statement is to be diverse, equitable, and inclusive in all we do, including our service delivery, decision-making, policies, and community engagement for all in our community now and in the future. And as we thought about that, a number of different areas kind of come to mind. Some where we've spent time and made progress, and others where, frankly, we've got work still to go. In conjunction with the mission statement, though, City Council and the administration agreed that we really needed to have a person that could work both internally and help us with our internal policies and our goals, as well as externally. And so we made the decision that we would hire a chief DEI officer. And after an extensive search, we're ecstatic to be able to ask Colleen to join us. And I'll say this publicly, but I've said this multiple times to Colleen already. I mean, she's already made quite a mark in the city. And if for those of you who may not have had a chance to interact much with her yet, I would encourage you to do that, because she is passionate, smart, and very thoughtful and helpful in analyzing or approaching difficult topics and difficult situations. And she's been a joy to work with. But when we hired Colleen, we had extensive conversations about what were the things that we were looking to achieve, or areas we were looking to improve. And it broke down into about seven categories, Colleen. And so we've been trying to make progress in all seven of these areas. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over. Start with you, Carmella. I'm going to turn it over to Colleen to start to talk, and then I'll jump back in on some of the things we've done, like just as an example, the recent formation of our diversity committee, which is now a formal city council committee, like we've had for in a number of other areas. And so Colleen's been instrumental in getting that up and going, but there are many other things as well. So with that, Colleen, I'll turn it over to you and hop back in.
Awesome, thank you. And thank you for your kind words. It's been a wild ride this first 6 months, and I'm excited to be here and to be able to come to a city with the reputation that Shaker has and help it really to make sure it remains a city that can live up to that expectation and that reputation. And you know what the mayor was talking about, when I started here, there were areas that were already outlined as my areas of responsibility. And so the city really wanted to focus its DEI attention on our city policies and services, workforce development and diversity training, and business diversity, so increasing procurement and contracting with diverse suppliers, metrics and data, so really getting numbers and making sure that our DEI efforts have goals that are measurable, forming a DEI committee, and then internal communications and engagement, and community communication and engagement. So a lot, right? And so I had to prioritize what to start with. And it was clear to me in my interview process that it was really important that we start internally. And that's because, you know, with our mission that the mayor read, we're talking about being equitable in our service delivery and a number of things. And the first thing I thought was, well, what are the situations within which our employees are asked to deliver these services? What does their situation look like internally as we're asking them to deliver services? And what are our policies and procedures for our employees? You know, what's happening here? And so we have January 26th, we released an RFP, a request for proposals for a DEI assessment to happen internally. So we will be having an official assessment, someone coming in, looking at our policies, procedures, and practices, and giving us a DEI plan that we can actually measure and set goals to. And so that's been happening. Also, the DEI committee, the formation of that, which was a lengthy process. I was so thrilled. I was nervous that there wouldn't be that many people that were interested in being involved, and we had over 100, and they streamed in, and they continued to come in. And so I was able to meet a lot of people in our community by having several individual conversations. I didn't have 100, but I had almost 30 with people who were going to work with us. And it was a joy to meet those people and to really put together a strong DEI committee with some strong subcommittees. And so that work is being established. There's also, conversations that are happening with some of our projects that are ongoing. I'm working with the Lee Road Action Plan to help and make sure that we are thinking broader and with DEI as a center focus as we start to do that plan. There's a lot of things that are happening at the city level. And we wanted to make sure that it's something that we talked about at our retreat, and it's part of our conversation. And CAO Chaikin said this to me: I see diversity, equity, inclusion as a value, not a goal, a value that needs to be within each one of our goals and be part of every department. And I really think that, and I feel it strongly. It's a value, it's not a goal. And we want to be able to measure our progress, but everything we should do should be through that lens. I ask my students that I teach about DEI, who's not here that should be here, whose voice are we not hearing, who is left out of this conversation, and is there anybody that our plan does not benefit, who won't have access to it the way that you do? And if we just really start to think about that almost as a checklist with all the decisions we make, we'll start to see improvements right away. It's obviously much deeper than that, but that's where we're starting. And we've hit the ground running. There's a lot happening, and I already instituted an entire training course. I personally delivered a training called Language Level Set that I created to every department. And it was to really make sure that the DEI language that is being used across the country right now, that we at least know what it is. We have an understanding of it. We have working definitions so they can get used to hearing this talk, because it's not going to stop. And we are going to have twice a year at least some type of training that every employee in the city has. And then we're creating an internal DEI committee to make sure we have things that are ongoing to support those trainings. So there's a lot. And then Dr. Burnley and I was just anxiously awaiting his arrival because to me, it's so important that we are collaborative in our efforts. I come from working with students, and it is so important to me that the culture that we set up around DEI inside that school is continued when they walk out of those doors. It's not just what they do in school. They need a welcoming and inclusive community to come home to, stores that they can go to without being followed, right? Being able to interact with their neighbors and have the same access to city resources, feel like they are welcome at the pool as anyone else, and those little things matter, because those are the things that leave marks on their lives. So that's a lot. And we're just getting started. I feel like the vet, since I've been here for 6 months and Dr. Burnley just got here, but it's just been a joy to meet and to work with him. And I think we have an exciting future.
Great. Larry, do you want to jump in there?
No, I'm excited just to hear what's happening with the city. Colleen, she and I have connected on a couple of occasions, and I'm thrilled, quite frankly, to have the opportunity to partner with her, the mayor, and others. There are a number of things that I won't kind of take a deep dive in. As in listening to Colleen, I was reflecting on the things that taking place in the district now in terms of professional development for teachers. I have a brand new office with four staff now. We're about to hire an executive assistant. So a lot of my attention really is, understanding this moment where we are developing, meeting people, developing relationships. I'm often asked, well, Dr. Burnley, what is your vision? And I say quickly that I don't come with a predetermined vision. I'm in the process of undergoing a process of engaging people so that we together are developing a vision that's not mine, but ours. Colleen said something else that was, I think, really important. Within the district, it's not clear to me that we're all really on the same page in terms of how we define these terms: diversity, equity, and inclusion. I think being on the same page is critical, and so I'm kind of learning that. The last thing I'll say is that building a sustainable infrastructure around this work, that, you know, we have these 4 staff members. We are members in the office, but we're not yet a team. And so giving attention to that, it's very easy to get kind of drawn into all the things that are going on without focusing on developing a solid foundation upon which we can build and do this work. And so I'm giving a lot of attention to that with my time as I'm onboarding here in the district.
Okay, thank you.
You know, Colleen, I would be remiss if I didn't jump back in for 1 minute and just note that you know how active and engaged our community and our organizations are in this area. I mean, you know, I talk with people from other communities, and when we start talking about what we're doing, there are many that say, wow, you know, you have a tremendous amount going on. And you know, I look at the participation tonight, and I know how many people are living and breathing every day this work, whether it be in their own work or in organizations within the community. And also, you know, the coordination and the conversation that goes on between the schools, the city, and I should mention the library as well. You know, just how much interaction and how much, you know, whether it be speakers or it be conversations that we have, that I think it's probably fair to say that almost on any given night of the week, you can find someone talking about DEI somewhere in the city. And that's really exciting too.
Carmella, may I add one more, just a really quick point? This is known, obviously, but it's worth saying, this work doesn't start with my arrival. I mean, there's extraordinary work going on across the district among the teachers, the student populations, the administrators. Too much to go into now, but this is really about really joining what has been taking place for some time and making contributions to advance it moving forward. So, yeah.
That is an excellent point, Larry, because as Kate mentioned, our city has some complicated history, or complex history. However, and even with all of that, we must acknowledge the progress, in that there was a time when this panel would not have looked like this, right? So we have made progress, and we still have work to do. So there's things to celebrate, and we have to roll up our sleeves and continue the work because it's intentional. And you know, all 3 of you talked a bit about what you were doing, and you mentioned how you measure that work. You measure success or some measurable. So my question would be, what are some keys or things to focus on when you measure how the work is going? What would be some things that are important that not only you look at, but that members of our community can hold close and determine how things are going, if we're moving in the right direction?
You know, go ahead, Mayor.
Sorry, I didn't direct traffic that time.
It's okay. Nobody's shy on this panel.
I'm really, you know, I always think, when I think about measuring diversity, equity, and inclusion, there are ways by which, I mean, we can count people in a room, right? We can set goals, and we can say, how diverse is this space? And we want to increase that by whatever percentage. We can do that. We can also, you know, look at access and have we eliminated barriers? Like, once we identify them, we can count how many we've eliminated. But for me, so much of this work is feeling based. And I don't know if that's because I'm an artist first, but so much of this is based on how you feel, right? I've been in a lot of spaces and I did not feel included, and you cannot measure that, right? That's a conversation you have to have with me. And that's a feeling, you know, that I would have to choose to share with you. You know, whether or not you feel welcome, whether or not you feel like you can authentically participate as your authentic self and fully engage. Those are things that without conversation and community, you won't know, you know, because if you look at us, we are so far ahead of what other spaces look like in terms of the makeup of our of our community and our schools. And you read our stats, we're doing a great job in certain areas. But if you go and talk to people, it doesn't always match. And so for me, the measure is how safe are people to say what they feel, to ask for what they need. It doesn't look like solutions, all the, everything's solved, but if people are willing to come and ask for what they need, if they are willing to take up space and lift their voice, those are measures of progress to me. If people are, you know, feeling safe to fully engage in the spaces that we create for them, or saying, hey, I don't have a space for me, but I have an idea and I would like to. Once people feel safer to do that, then I think we're on our way somewhere. And that doesn't necessarily look like progress. It might feel more like people complaining, but to me, I see it as people speaking up, because I'm not going to tell you my need if I don't think you're interested enough to try to meet it. If all of a sudden people are telling us their needs and they have an expectation that they're going to be heard, that to me is progress. So there's so many ways by which it can be measured. But I mean, I'm a feelings person. I've always been accused of that. And that's one of the things I get right in there. How do you feel? And I have a lot of conversations. So there's patience that's required for that method. But I think that's how you really, that is one of the ways that I measure that success.
Okay.
And that's just my 2 cents.
Okay.
One of the, there are a number of ways, so that's a really fascinating question. We know that in terms of student success, there are traditional metrics that we continue to use to gauge student success: grade point averages, graduation rates, reading, math competency at grade level, et cetera. Now, those are very important. However, through the lens of DE&I, there are other metrics that I think that are critical. For instance, we can measure and evaluate and assess intercultural competency among leaders, for instance, and teachers. We can measure that. There are instruments where we can establish baselines and then actually look at progress in terms of how professionals are either growing in the area of intercultural competency and how that's applied in the workspaces or not. We can measure, for instance, social climate in terms of in classrooms or in workspaces, and the extent to which persons feel like they belong or not. We can actually measure, quite frankly, measuring the extent to which our students see themselves reflected in the curriculum and the materials that they're required to read. I'm a historian by training, and I think with all the work that we've done over the decades or even longer with regard to advancing multiculturalism, diversity, equity, and inclusion, curricula in U.S. education, and this is including Shaker, of course, is largely not being, is largely not accomplished an inclusive curriculum, meaning that we're still graduating students who have not been exposed to the extraordinary scholarship and narratives and stories of marginalized and minoritized people across multiple disciplines: history, English, social studies, even the kinds of problems that are being presented in math classes or other STEM-related courses. I've built a career in college and universities before I arrived here, and it's amazing to me what students don't know or what they've not been exposed to at this level. Shaker students are telling me even now that they often don't know the stories, for instance, of indigenous populations from indigenous perspectives. The stories of women from the perspective of women. So there's still this kind of Eurocentric kind of hegemony, if you will, or dominance in terms of this dominant narrative. While those stories are important, that we need to be more inclusive, and there are ways to measure that. We're here in Black History Month, and sadly, a Black History Month is still needed, right? Because those narratives remain marginalized. So my story as an African American remains an elective and not required. We can measure that. We can measure the kind of the books in terms of that we're adopting, for our children to read and to learn. We can measure, in fact, moving a faculty and staff from a place of inviting them into spaces where they're taking a deep dive into intercultural or culturally responsive pedagogy, or to really look at systemic forms of oppression and understanding what race is, for instance, and why it was created, and how it's this social construction informs how we teach, what we teach, how we see each other and ourselves. We can measure that, but often we do not. So we're moving from a place of inviting, for instance, faculty into these spaces of professional development to deal with very complex conversations, to expecting them to do that and tying, performance and advancement and promotion to demonstrating how one is growing in these very important areas. And finally, something that Colleen mentioned earlier is something that we're taking steps toward now, and to develop measuring how we're spending our money. Supplier diversity does not show up currently in our strategic plan, but we are taking steps now. We're bringing in an outside consultant to introduce the concept of supplier diversity. How does our commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, how does it show up, and how is it demonstrated by giving access to minority, women, veteran, disabled owned business, business enterprises? We need to measure that, right? Because we know there are barriers that keep a number of groups marginalized on the margins. And so, so we can measure those things. So, data analytics, data collection and analytics through the lenses of DE&I are sorely needed. We're doing some things now. Colleen mentioned some things, but we can do a lot better, and we will. I'm convinced of that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Maybe let me just add to it. Well, let me start by saying I think while I don't have all the answers about how we should best measure our progress, it is clearly important to find ways to do that, because we all know that maybe the numbers don't always say the whole story. I've said this for years, that even in our community, at one level, at a macro level, you might look at one number and say we are a very diverse community, and yet at the same time we also know that you may look at a micro level and see a very different picture, even though the population is still diverse at a macro level. And so I think, my sense is that you need to have some interesting and different ways to measure what we're trying to accomplish. Some I think can be very numeric, and maybe others, less so. I've been really remain focused on a number of different areas, but I think, for instance, in the area of procurement, are we providing opportunities to continue that diversity in our hiring, in our contracting? We've been very active in our economic development area to help promote minority-owned businesses and women-owned businesses, and those are very measurable. I mean, that we can do that. It doesn't take much. That's not that hard, and we can very much measure how we are doing. So I think it's important to just make sure you come at it from all different angles. Some will be very easy. Other ones may be much more difficult. And I agree with Colleen. Some of it is hard to measure how you feel when you enter a room. But I think we got to find ways to do both the hard numbers and some more of the way people feel about how they're treated in their community or in their different environments.
Okay, thank you. And before I ask my next question, I wanted to remind our attendees to go ahead and drop questions in the chat as they come to you. If you sit there with a question, holding on to it, you miss an opportunity to get that answer you want, and you may forget the question. So go ahead and drop it in there. So can you talked a bit about, you kind of talked a bit about how your work resonates in the community, each organization, how that work resonates in the community. Can you talk a bit about how this work benefits the community as a whole. So, we've been very school specific, city specific, but for the person that may have limited use of city services or may not have children in the school district, how does this work benefit them in ways they don't know? And okay, let's start with Larry.
So how does the work benefit all of us in ways that we don't know?
Mm-hmm.
Oh gosh, there's so many ways. Go ahead, Colleen. No, Willie. No. Well, somebody said a long time ago that in this country, in many ways, many of us came over here on different boats. Some didn't come on a boat at all. They were already here, but we're going down on the same one because so much that we're doing is driven by fear, quite frankly, and the lens of viewing the world, ourselves, and others that has been shaped and informed and colored, if you will, by very politicized agendas and agendas of greed and gross kind of consumption and issues of power. So the work that we're doing is really inviting us to learn how to see ourselves and others in ways that's not fear driven, that we're moving us to a norm of not so much competition, but cooperation and of community. Dr. King talked about the beloved community. What does that actually look like? When I can see actually myself in others, so that I'm actually driven, wanting to love and serve and do good to someone else because I realize I am because they are. Dr. Archbishop Tutu often use South African concept or term of Ubuntu, which is this concept that talks about I am because you are. And so the shift, is from focusing on the individual to that of the community. This work that we do, I think, contributes to developing a different type of norm. We're invited to, and even challenged, I think, to reframe our notion of excellence, our notion of greatness, right? Which is really tied not so much to dominance, but of service. So I think this work helps us contribute to that. Finally, I would say that the work of diversity, equity, inclusion has value from an educational standpoint, not only in the area of Black excellence or helping students who are underachieving to kind of achieve the kind of student success as traditionally measured. It has value for all of our students. It's interesting to me that there are ridiculous amounts of money being spent by Fortune 500 companies in this space of DE&I. You know why? Because they recognize that they need employees who know how to work effectively and engage and communicate effectively across multiple dimensions of human difference. They understand that they've drawn the line between DE&I and intercultural competency to their bottom line. Mm-hmm. Innovation is driven by diversity, the ability to work. Markets are increasingly becoming diverse. And so we, from an educational standpoint, all children, if they're getting a 2.0 or 4.0, they could be really severely damaged, if you will, if they're not graduating, if we're not creating learning spaces where they learn how to value the other and to work effectively across, again, multiple dimensions of human difference. And a lot of our children, the schools are producing children that are not able to do that, but yet corporate America and transnational corporations, that's exactly what they're looking for. So it has value. There's a business argument to be made in that way as well. I'll stop there because there's so much more. And I'm anxious to hear about the mayor and David and Colleen has to say.
Okay, go ahead, David.
Larry, man, I love you, but you're a hard act to follow sometimes. I'm going to focus on one. I agree. There are lots of different areas, but I'm going to focus on one for our community. And I think DEI is as much, for many people, is as much of a draw to our community as many of the other assets that we have in our community, whether it be the schools, whether it be the beauty of our parks, our architecture, um, and but a fundamental underpinning, and someone mentioned it earlier, the value proposition, if you will. People come to this community because they see the benefit and the joy that's produced by having both a diverse and also an international community, with people coming from all over the world to live in Shaker. And so, but that doesn't mean that it just happens because people want it to happen or they think it's happening. We actually need to make sure that we are, in fact, it's a little overused, but not just talking the talk, but walking the walk. And we all know from our history, and even today, on any given day, we make progress and we make some mistakes. And I think the benefit for us is being able to have conversations like this and many others that I have every day, where people pick up the phone, and we all know in Shaker, we're not bashful. We're passionate about what we do, and we pick up the phone and we will call, whether they're our elected officials or whether they're teachers or school administrators or others, and say, hey, I think we fell short. And here's why. And to me, that's it's a constant journey. And to me, that's what that is a major focus of what of our brand, if you will, in Shaker. And but we need to work on it every single day. And so anyway, that's maybe a little different take on it, but that's the way I often, view what we do or don't do sometimes in Shaker.
Hey, thank you, David. Colleen?
Mine is a little all over the place, and it's because there's so many reasons why I came to this work. I came to this work as an artist. I came to this work because I lived the results of the work not being done. That was the work, this work not being done, these examinations not being made, the lack of progress showed up drastically in my day-to-day life. As Ms. Barrett put in the chat, otherism, right? I sit in the place of being othered in almost every place that I am a part of. And so it has such an impact on me. And I didn't want to just endure it. I wanted it to be a little bit better for the people that came behind me. So one of the reasons why I came to this work, and if we go back to your measurement and data question, while I understand the feelings component, I know the importance of it. Why do we do this work? So that we can measure it. Because when you realize how little progress you've made in an area and you didn't know it until it was measured, then you're like, whoa, wait a second. I didn't know it was that bad. Anytime I share an experience or something that I go through with somebody, you often get those people that say, I didn't know that. I can't believe that's still happening. It's not that bad, is it? We sometimes think we've made more progress than we have. And sometimes just stopping to look and count and measure and see and ask makes a huge difference. It impacts the community as a whole, because the results of a diverse, equitable, and inclusive society is the kind of world we want to live in. It's what will make us feel safe, because we don't have the unnecessary fear that's attached to bias that we haven't examined, right? When you start to learn and get in relationship and community with people, some of that stuff goes by the wayside. We all of a sudden have that community that we see in the sitcoms that we're like, oh, I want to live in a place like that where I don't have to lock my doors, right? We don't have trust. When there's no equity there, there's always someone with a lack that needs. If you have a lack, that's where you get taking from, right? When we get to a place where everybody is looked after and there's equity there, then that's the kind of community I want to live in. And so if I can do my part to help create that, create spaces for people to educate themselves, hopefully some decades from now, those pockets of that kind of community exists in spaces. So it does benefit the people who don't have kids in the schools, because they need to learn about it so that they can live it when they come out. It does benefit people who are not actively involved in a lot of the things that happen in the city, because it's still the community within which they live. And I just think it has utmost importance. I don't think it is ever fully achieved. It's something that's ongoing. But if we're all mindful of it, gosh, this would be a better place to be.
Mhm. Oh, all three of you get an amen from me. That's the type of energy we need for this work, because it gets hard, but there's always hope. So, and you all have talked a little bit about the importance of collaboration, the importance of being intentional. I've been watching the chat. There's invitations to the school's finance and audit committee. There is we've talked about some ways that people can plug in. There's a question here from Jill she asked, how will our city and schools DEI efforts be involved in the Forward Together process? She says it's so important that all voices are heard in that effort, and I worry about their inclusion. So, you all have talked about making seats at the table, the importance of having people involved. Can you speak to that a little bit about, and I'll start with you, David, about the DEI efforts and that lens being included in the Forward Together effort?
Sure. Thanks, Colleen. Boy, yeah, lots of places to start, lots of angles to come in on this one. But
Thanks, Carmella, for starting with David. Appreciate it.
But let me start by saying that at its underpinnings, the Forward Together initiative, what makes it unique, what makes it different, again, different than other communities, was the idea that the schools and the library and the city could come together and share experiences, share what they're doing, work together, do things on a collaborative basis, and make our community, at its core, make our community better by communicating with each other. I say this, I was on city council in the late 90s, and to be completely candid, the library and the schools, and the city, particularly the schools in the city, their paths rarely crossed. It was a campaign goal of mine in the 90s to just get a meeting together of the schools and the city, and it wasn't that there was necessarily animosity. It was just we did our own thing. There were silos, and people went down the path that they were used to and familiar with and were comfortable with, and it was easy to sort of not have to worry about necessarily a diversity sometimes of opinions on things. And so when we finally had a single meeting together back in the late 90s, I was happy about it. But, as you can tell, I mean, that's, we were just scratching the surface. And so one of the ideas about Forward Together was, how do we really encourage ongoing discussion? And so one of the things we've talked about is that this idea of Forward Together is not a project. It's not a single issue process, that this is something that we hope will be ongoing to raise all kinds of issues to work together. It doesn't mean we're necessarily going to agree, but it provides an opportunity for us to share ideas. And so sharing ideas and understanding each other and working together the fundamental underpinnings of DEI work in many respects. And so, you know, to me, this is just an ongoing process and an evolution and a growing of of us as a community. Having said all that, though, let me also just say that you know, it's been a fascinating process going through the Forward Together initiative currently. One of the goals of Forward Together was coming up with, as many of you know, a long-term facilities plan, which could serve as a blueprint or guideline or guidestone as to how we invest, not only invest our limited resources, but also how we advance the values that we hold dear in Shaker. So just as an example, education being one of those fundamental and key values of our community. So how do we stay competitive? How do we educate our children, not just today, but literally 5, 10, 15 years from now? And what are the facilities that we need to put in place today and or processes to make sure that we are achieving the goals that we want to achieve as a community? But what's been really fascinating to me about it is that even though we were talking about facilities, and that's the focus at one level, the conversation that's come out has raised all kinds of issues, even about facilities. Have we been equitable in how we've allocated resources within our community in the past, today, and how do we do that in the future? And it has sparked all kinds of discussion among the general public, as well as our advisory committee, as well as our elected officials, to say, how do we do things? You know, is what we're talking about as it relates to facilities. Yes, that's sort of, if you will, that's the medium that we're talking about. But how do we make that equitable? How do we encourage inclusion within ourselves, within our own community? And how are we allocating resources and making decisions? And is everyone at the table? And I've heard loud and clear that, you know, some days we're doing a good job. Other days we've still got work ahead of us. And so to me, this is just an example of what makes us different and special. We can have these conversations and someone can say, you know, what you thought was equitable is really not, and here's why. Or I want you to think about this, because from my perspective, you know, I view the world a little differently. And so as difficult sometimes as these conversations are, which I acknowledge I thought would be the case, as difficult as they are, we have to learn how to have these conversations and to recognize and acknowledge the past and then try to do better in the future. And so I'll stop there because I could go on all night on it. But to me, it's been as difficult at times and how we can always do better. It's been a fascinating and invigorating place to have some conversations, DEI conversations in the context of long-range facility planning.
Okay, thank you, David. So, you know what, our time is coming to an end. So I'd like to, if it's okay with Kate and the Historical Society, I'd like to give everyone a quick, say, minute to give us some closing statements. And I'll start with you, Colleen.
Thank you. And I'll be brief. It's so great to be able to have an opportunity to have these conversations, right? And I think your last question really illuminated something that I think is the purpose of my job, right? So Jill, I echo your concern about not every voice being heard and not every voice being included. And so I think that is something that we understand. And I think my job is kind of, why don't people speak up? Why not? And that's an indicator of work to be done, not necessarily a space where they feel like it will matter. And I'm here to kind of help us shift towards full inclusion. Diverse, we kind of got that down. inclusion, we need to make the shift to that. And we really need to make it a space where we can talk to people about why they don't want to talk. Where is that lack of trust coming from? Do they think if they say something, anything will be done? What is the point? Because when you ask people to share, there's emotional labor involved. And I think with that comes a responsibility with what you do with what has been shared with you. And so it's my job, to start to try and encourage those conversations. Again, one of the ways by which I measure my success, how willing are people to speak up? Because that means they find safety in their feelings, perspectives with the person they're giving it to. And so that's what I leave you with. Like, I just got here. It's just beginning. But this Forward Together process is a way by which I can get in there and say, talk to me about why you don't want to talk to me, right? And I think that's huge. So thanks for having me today.
Thank you, Colleen. Larry, go ahead.
Thank you. First, thank you for the invitation and opportunity to be a part of this conversation. I want to, leave by building on something the mayor that David just said, and that is, and I said this to David in a meeting, my first meeting with him, quite frankly, with others, is that we can't move forward together unless we know each other's stories. We need to know each other's stories. We need to, we have to prioritize and really value authentically positioning ourselves to hear the narratives and stories of the other, particularly those groups that have been minoritized and marginalized, because those are the ones that are disproportionately the stories that we don't hear, not only in spaces like this, but again, I'm going back to the school, to the curriculum, right? These stories are marginalized. They're not at the center of intellectual or academic and educational discourses. Their voices, their stories, their histories don't matter, right? And so we have to make sure that they matter for us as leaders and educators, politicians. So if the Forward Together initiative didn't exist at all, I would hope that the priority of hearing the stories of those across the district in equitable ways will remain a priority. It's not a priority just because we're trying to get something passed, but that this becomes central part of how we operate, because our stories really do matter. And they're often difficult. And sometimes out of our power and privilege of various types, race, gender, socioeconomic status, et cetera, sexual orientation, we can choose not to hear someone's story. We don't have to enter into that space where it might be uncomfortable. So I'm hoping that we learn to be comfortable with being uncomfortable and recognize that as a value, an essential part of an ingredient of our ability to really move forward together.
Okay, thank you, David.
Thank you. Yeah, maybe I'll kind of pick up on where Larry just left off. I like the visual that I have when you talk about stories, and but I'll just add to it that yeah, we all have stories, but unless we talk to each other about what they are, you won't ever know what stories people really have. And so, part of it is being able to have, frankly, organizations like the Historical Society have forums and opportunities like this where we can have the conversations and start to talk about some of the stories. But beyond that, and I think we can talk, but we also know that there are decisions that have to be made, and we need to be very cognizant and make sure that we really do make sure we bring all the voices to the table, because decisions ultimately do have to be made. And whether it's for someone like me as an elected official, or whether it's someone as an administrator in the school, or frankly decisions being made by our teachers or our service providers in the city, we're all making decisions every single day, and our actions have implications and have ramifications, and we need to look very hard. I think I saw in the chat, think deeply about these issues and make sure that we're being sensitive to the unintended consequences. And are we making progress? Is it I've started to use that sort of a net positive to our DEI goals? Is it a positive? Are we making progress? And that takes hard choices and some hard decisions, but it also is what we should be doing. And so we got to start somewhere by talking, but then we also need to make sure that the decisions we make are consistent with those same values.
Thank you, thank you. And you know what, well, first off, I want to thank the Historical Society for, again, creating this space. And quickly, I'll just say, as the mayor mentioned, I'm also an elected official. However, I, like all of you, are members of this community, whether you live here or work here. And there is a position for all of us to play. We all have a role in this work. And it's not for, let's put it this way, it's no one should be on the sidelines. We should all be active participants, and we're all stakeholders. So we owe each other that effort, that commitment to be intentional and to engage with one another, share our stories, and listen to each other and try and do this together, because we create a better place for ourselves and for everyone else if we do the work. So thank you all again. We could have gone on for at least, I don't know, 20 more hours. But one will have to do it for tonight. And again, it's the first part. So thank you, Kate. Thank you, Historical Society.
And I just want to step in and say, again, thank you all so much. And thank you for everyone who dropped information and resources into the chat.
Yeah.
As everyone has been saying, this is a community effort and an ongoing effort. And for the Historical Society, history just isn't our past. It's something that we're creating every single day.
Amen.
This conversation was incredible, and I appreciate every single one of you for participating. And I look forward to next year.
Okay, everyone take care. Have a good weekend. Stay
Bye,
safe.
everybody.
Thank
All
you.
right, bye-bye.
Take care.